I arrived at the ballroom that night believing it would be a celebration of everything I had built alongside my husband. The chandeliers glistened like constellations above us, the air heavy with champagne and whispered admiration, and I smoothed the emerald silk of my dress, the one Robert had chosen for me only last week. At 52, I had learned to carry myself with quiet dignity, even when my heart often ached in the silence of our home. For 23 years, I had been more than just a wife. I had been a partner, a co-founder, the invisible hand that steadied his empire when storms threatened to break it apart. Yet as I crossed that glittering room, filled with power and politics, I sensed the strange chill of conversations cut short, glances cast sideways, smiles that were not smiles at all, but pity disguised in politeness. I had once been proud of being Mrs. Robert Sterling, co-owner of the company that had become tonight's crown jewel, but in that moment, my name sounded more like a shadow. Still, I walked forward, head held high, because I had taught myself over decades that silence and composure were sometimes the only weapons a woman could wield. I greeted wives of governors, clients who had feasted at my table, business partners whose contracts I had reviewed while Robert slept. They congratulated me with hollow tones, their eyes drifting quickly away, as if I carried a secret stain across my gown that only they could see. When I finally spotted Robert near the stage, his silver hair gleaming under the lights, his laughter booming as he charmed investors, I felt the instinctive pull of devotion. I touched his arm gently, whispering his name as I had done countless times in rooms like this. For a fraction of a second, his mask slipped. There was no joy at seeing me, no pride, only a flicker of annoyance before he summoned a polite smile. "Oh, Margaret, you're here." Flat dismissive, like I was an afterthought, an unwelcome guest. The circle around him dispersed uncomfortably, leaving me standing in the cold spotlight of humiliation. I swallowed the burn rising in my throat, but the whispers carried easily through the golden hum of the party. "There's the frigid wife who can't satisfy him." I heard it as if the words had been carved directly into my skin. Another voice, crueler, sharper. "She has no idea about Vanessa." About Vanessa, his assistant. The young woman in scarlet silk who appeared beside me with the confidence of someone who knew she had already replaced me. She smiled with the kind of pity that cuts deeper than open hatred. Her perfume was sharp, her words sharper. She told me this night wasn't for wives, that I was no longer needed. And then, like a knife twisted in public, she summoned security to escort me out. My husband did not move. He turned his back and continued speaking about quarterly projections, while his wife of 2 decades was dragged through a room full of eyes, each pair reflecting my disgrace. The marble stairs outside the hotel felt colder than any winter storm. In my clutch was a velvet box containing the bracelet I had commissioned engraved with the coordinates of the Malibu beach, where Robert had once promised me forever. I had meant to give it to him tonight, a reminder of where we began. Now the box slipped from my fingers onto the concrete, as if it too had chosen to leave him behind. I let it stay there. Let someone else decide its worth. Inside my chest, grief should have bloomed. But as I walked toward the garage, another feeling rose instead, something harder, sharper. Rage, yes, but beneath it a kind of clarity I had not felt in years. By the time I reached my car, I knew I could no longer be the woman who waited silently at the edges of his empire. In the driver's seat, I allowed myself to think, really think about the pattern of erasure that had become my life. His articles always credited him alone. His successes framed as his genius, never mentioning the inheritance. I had mortgaged the contracts. I had negotiated the connections from my family's law firm that had opened doors he could never have unlocked alone. My entire existence had been repackaged as his alone, and I had let it happen until tonight. The phone calls began before I even left the garage. His name flashing across the screen 30, 40, 50 times, but I declined every one. Let him taste the silence he had forced upon me for years. Let him feel the absence of my loyalty. My hand trembled only once when I called my financial advisor and gave instructions that would unravel everything Robert believed was indestructible. Liquidate all 17 million of my stake in Sterling Enterprises, freeze every joint account, cancel every credit card. The words tasted like steel, and for the first time in decades, my voice did not shake. By the time I reached home, the missed call counter had risen to numbers I never thought I'd see. But each unanswered ring became a stone in the foundation of my resolve. I was not going to crumble, not this time. The following morning, my home office became my battlefield. I opened filing cabinets filled with 23 years of careful record-keeping. Every receipt, every bank statement, every contract bore silent witness to my contributions. And I photographed them one by one, building a digital arsenal. There was the original incorporation paper, with my signature beside his, the loan guarantee secured against my personal assets, the inheritance I poured into his first acquisition, the mortgage I risked during the recession. Piece by piece, I laid bare the truth that he had tried to bury beneath his empire. When my advisor confirmed that my liquidation had triggered panic in the markets, I almost smiled. For the first time, Robert was forced to acknowledge the existence of the woman he had erased. And when Vanessa herself texted me with audacity dripping from her words, "Perhaps we could have coffee and clear up last night's misunderstanding," I replied with the final blow, "There was no misunderstanding. And it's Miss Hartford now. I'm reclaiming my name." Even my sister called, her voice full of his panic, begging me to stop. She told me Robert said I was having a breakdown. But I corrected her. "I've found my mind. For the first time in years, I am not breaking down, I am breaking free." That morning, as the sun poured into the garden, I had tended with my own hands. While Robert never noticed, I understood that this was more than revenge. It was reclamation. A woman can only be invisible for so long before the weight of her silence turns into fire. And my silence had burned long enough. The morning headlines were the kind of poetry only fate could compose. Sterling Empire shaken as co-founder divests millions overnight. For years, my name had been absent from their glossy magazine spreads and industry reports. Now it was suddenly everywhere, not as a footnote, but as the fulcrum on which the entire empire teetered. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of black coffee, the silence broken only by the rustling of newspapers I spread across the counter. Each headline confirmed what I already knew: Robert's empire had never been his alone. It was ours. And when I walked away, it began to bleed. The first call came from the board of directors. A man whose voice had always carried smug authority now spoke with a cautious tremor. "Mrs. Sterling, or Miss Hartford as the papers say, we need you to reconsider. Without your shares, we risk instability." I let the silence stretch, savoring the reversal. For decades, I had sat at dinners where these same men treated me as ornamental, the wife in pearls who smiled politely while they discussed billion-dollar strategies. Now they sought me out, desperate, deferential. My answer was soft but final. "Perhaps you should ask Robert. After all, he's the genius behind it all, isn't he?" I hung up before he could stumble through his excuses. Robert himself appeared at my door an hour later. His once immaculate suit looked wrinkled, his hair disheveled as though he had pulled at it all night. For the first time in years, he seemed smaller, less like the titan he projected to the world, and more like the aging man who could no longer hide behind bravado. He stood in my doorway, his eyes frantic. "Margaret, we need to talk." I leaned casually against the frame, my arms crossed. "Do we? You seemed very clear last night when you turned your back on me." He stepped closer, desperation seeping through his voice. "It was a mistake. I should never have let that happen. Vanessa, she doesn't mean anything. You know how these things look at parties. Please, we can fix this." His words landed like fragile glass, too delicate to hold weight. I thought of the years I had waited for apologies that never came, for recognition that was always withheld. Now that he stood before me begging, I felt nothing. No pity, no desire. Just the cold clarity of someone who had finally stepped outside the fog of manipulation. "I don't think you understand, Robert," I said quietly. "This isn't about Vanessa. It never was. It's about 23 years of erasure, and I'm done. The look on his face was one I will never forget, equal parts shock and fear. He reached for my hand, but I pulled it back before his fingers could graze mine. The space between us felt like an entire lifetime collapsing. That evening, I opened the safe I had kept hidden beneath the floorboards of my office. Inside were journals I had written over the years, diaries of board meetings I wasn't invited to, but overheard notes about conversations where Robert twisted my words into his victories. Each page was a testament to the invisible labor of being his partner, the kind of labor history rarely records. I scanned them into my computer, creating a digital archive. If he tried to paint me as irrational as hysterical, I would counter with evidence of a woman who had carried the weight of his empire on her back. For the first time, my story would not be erased. The panic spread quickly. Business partners called anxious about the sudden volatility. Friends of Robert's, those who had once smiled at me with condescension, now texted with cautious kindness, hoping to stay in my good graces. Even Vanessa herself appeared at the gate of my property, her designer heels sinking into the gravel as she called my name. I opened the window upstairs and looked down at her. She was beautiful, yes, but her face carried the strain of someone who had overplayed her hand. "I never meant for things to go this far," she called up, her voice trembling. "Please, can we talk?" I almost laughed. "Talk? You called security on me, Vanessa. You erased me from my own life. And now you want to talk?" I closed the window, letting the glass sever the conversation. But the truth is, she wasn't the enemy. She was only the symptom. The real betrayal had always come from Robert, the man who allowed her to wield power over me because he thought I would never fight back. As days turned into weeks, I found myself in uncharted territory. I had money in accounts only I could access, lawyers eager to represent me, and headlines framing me as the woman who toppled a dynasty. Yet beneath the power, there was a gnawing emptiness. Revenge had given me control, but it hadn't healed the raw wound of betrayal. One night, unable to sleep, I walked through the garden where I used to wait for Robert's car lights to appear in the driveway. I remembered the woman I had been younger, hopeful, believing that loyalty would be enough to earn loyalty in return. That woman was gone. In her place was someone harder, wiser, but lonelier too. It was then that my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You may have won against Robert, but you don't know everything." Attached was a scanned document, an offshore account opened in my name, without my knowledge transferring funds that could make me appear complicit in his schemes. My breath caught. Even now, even broken Robert had found a way to try to drag me down with him. I forwarded the document to my lawyer, my hand steady despite the storm inside me. "Prepare a statement," I told him. "If he wants a war, I'll give him one. But this time the world will see who he really is." The next morning, I called a press conference. Standing at the podium, cameras flashing in a frenzy, I felt the weight of generations of silenced women pressing behind me. My voice did not waver as I spoke. For 23 years, I was called a useless wife. But I built half of what you see standing today. And when I walked away, it began to crumble. Robert Sterling is not the man you think he is. He is not the empire. He is the fraud who erased the woman who made it possible. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions, their pens scratching furiously. In that moment, I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't erased. I was the author of the truth. And yet, when I returned home that night, I sank onto my bed and allowed the tears to come. Not for Robert, not for Vanessa, but for the years I had lost, the birthdays missed because he was busy, the anniversaries overshadowed by business trips, the countless moments I had silenced my own voice to preserve his pride. Those years would never return. Revenge had given me power, but grief was still my companion. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I realized the war was far from over. Because sometimes the deepest wounds aren't from enemies, they're from the people we once loved. The weeks following the press conference were a blur of flashing cameras, urgent phone calls, and the relentless hum of a world that suddenly wanted to hear my voice. For years I had been invisible, relegated to the background of Robert's empire. But now journalists requested interviews. Women I'd never met sent letters thanking me for standing up, and even old friends reached out offering support I hadn't expected. But beneath the tidal wave of attention was an undercurrent of dread. Because Robert was not a man who surrendered easily. I had seen him claw his way through Market's rivals, even friends, if it meant keeping his crown intact. Now that I had threatened the very foundation of his identity, I knew he would fight with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. It didn't take long for his counterattack to begin. One morning as I poured my coffee, the television blared with breaking news. Sterling accuses wife of fraud claims she co-signed offshore accounts. The image of my own signature flashed across the screen, pasted onto documents that made me look like an accomplice to his schemes. For a moment my chest tightened, the old panic threatening to crush me, but then I breathed, steadying myself against the kitchen counter. I had seen those papers before. They were real, except for the signature. A forgery, one of many ways Robert had tried to bind me to his sins without my consent. My lawyer assured me we could prove it, but the damage to my reputation began immediately. The same people who had celebrated me last week now whispered again, uncertain if I was heroine or fraud. The cruelty of public opinion is that it always searches for cracks, eager to believe a woman's rise is tainted. That night, I sat alone in the study, staring at the piles of journals, contracts, and photographs I had archived. Each page bore the weight of my life's invisible labor. I felt the old ache creeping in. What if he won again? What if his lies once more became the story people chose to believe? Then I remembered the moment outside the ballroom when Vanessa had summoned security and Robert had turned his back. That humiliation had carved itself into me so deeply that even now, months later, it pulsed like a scar beneath my skin. I whispered aloud to no one but myself, never again. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse with boxes of evidence. The air inside was cold, the marble floors echoing every step I took. Robert was already there, flanked by lawyers, his face composed, but his eyes darting nervously when he saw the weight of the files I carried. I testified with calm precision, laying out each document, each signature, each record of the assets I had invested, the contracts I had negotiated, the inheritance I had risked. I told the story of a woman erased, of a partner disguised as an accessory, of a wife labeled useless while quietly carrying half the empire on her shoulders. When the forged signatures were analyzed and exposed, I saw Robert's jaw clench, his hands gripping the table until his knuckles whitened. For the first time, his mask cracked in public. He looked not like a titan of industry, but like a man cornered by the truth he could no longer rewrite. The judge's gavel echoed like thunder when she ruled that I had no liability in his offshore accounts. In fact, the evidence suggested he had deliberately forged my name. The whispers in the courtroom turned sharp, accusatory, not at me, but at him. I should have felt triumph. And part of me did. But there was also sorrow. Sorrow for the years I had wasted believing in a man who could so easily betray not just my love, but my very identity. After court, as I walked down the steps, microphones thrust toward me. A reporter asked, "What do you feel, Miss Hartford?" Victory. I paused, letting the spring air fill my lungs. "Not victory," I said softly. "Vindication. There's a difference." That night, Robert tried one last time. He appeared at my gate, disheveled and frantic. Through the intercom, his voice cracked with something I hadn't heard in years: desperation. "Margaret, please. You've made your point. You've destroyed me. But we built this life together. Don't you remember the beginning? Don't you remember Malibu?" Ah, Malibu. The beach where he had once pressed a seashell into my hand and promised me forever. The coordinates I had engraved onto the bracelet now lying abandoned in some gutter outside the hotel ballroom. For a moment my heart stung with the echo of who we had once been. But then I remembered the feel of the cold marble beneath me as security dragged me away while he turned his back. I remembered the years of silence, of invisibility, of humiliation packaged as love. I pressed the intercom button, my voice calm. "I remember everything, Robert. That's why I'm walking away." I turned off the system before he could respond. Through the window I watched him stand there, shoulders slumped, before finally walking back into the darkness. In the quiet that followed, I realized something profound. Revenge had never been about destroying him. It had been about reclaiming me, And though I had bruises where trust once lived, I felt the faint stirrings of peace. Still late at night when the world was quiet, I wondered what scars I had carved into myself by staying silent for so long, and what scars I might still bear from fighting back. Because justice is rarely clean, it leaves marks even on the victor. The war was not finished. There were still settlements to negotiate, reputations to repair, a life to rebuild. But for the first time in decades, the future felt like mine, and mine alone. The settlement negotiations stretched on for weeks, each meeting a battle of wills staged in sterile conference rooms with polished mahogany tables and bitter coffee. Robert arrived flanked by lawyers and advisors, all carefully orchestrating his image as a man wronged by a vindictive wife. But each time they presented arguments, my counsel and I answered with meticulous documentation, receipts, contracts, recordings. For every lie he attempted, I had the truth waiting like a blade sharpened on years of silence. One morning, midway through proceedings, I stepped into the women's lounge during a recess. Vanessa was there, leaning against the sink, her reflection in the mirror, as composed as if she belonged to this war. She didn't startle when she saw me, she simply straightened her shoulders as though preparing for her own performance. "You won, you know," she said, smoothing the silk of her blouse. "He'll never recover from this." I studied her carefully. The woman who had once looked at me with triumph now carried shadows beneath her eyes. "Then why are you still here?" I asked. Her lips curved into something between a smirk and a grimace. "Because I want to see how far you'll go. Because maybe I thought I wanted to be you, until I realized what it cost." Her words struck deeper than I expected. For a moment, I almost pitied her, the young woman who mistook his charm for devotion, who didn't yet understand that Robert's love was always conditional, always a transaction. But pity passed quickly. I washed my hands in silence, the sound of water filling the space between us, and left without another word. That night I sat in my study. The documents spread before me like a battlefield map. The numbers, the dates, the transactions, they were all proof of betrayal, but also of something else: my endurance. Every page was a scar, but also a testament. And yet, beneath the satisfaction of wielding this evidence, I felt the weight of exhaustion. Revenge had given me a voice, but it demanded energy I no longer wanted to spend on him. Then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived. Not from Robert, not from his lawyers, but from his mother. A woman who had once dismissed me as too quiet, too ordinary for her ambitious son. Her handwriting trembled across the page. "I know what he's done. I know you carried more than anyone gave you credit for. Whatever happens, Margaret, know that not all of us are blind." I held the letter against my chest and wept. Because for all the battles I had fought, recognition, even this late, even this small, felt like a balm on wounds I hadn't realized were still bleeding. The climax came during the final settlement hearing. Robert sat across from me. His hands clasped his suit, immaculate, despite the storm unraveling his empire. His lawyers argued that I was entitled to a modest share, nothing more, painting me once again as the supportive wife who had contributed little. I stood slowly, deliberately, holding a folder so thick it seemed to strain my grasp. My lawyer tried to intervene, but I shook my head. This was mine to deliver. I was called useless. I began, my voice steady, though the room was silent. For 23 years I was dismissed, diminished, erased. But here's the truth. I laid out the incorporation documents with both our signatures, the inheritance transfer records, the mortgage I had placed on my own property to fund his acquisitions, emails where he referred to my advice as his own strategies, journal entries that documented every lie, every humiliation. One by one, the documents covered the table until Robert's lawyers had no space left to maneuver. His face, pale and taut, betrayed a crack in the facade he clung to. For the first time, he could not interrupt, could not charm, could not erase. When I placed the last page, a record of the offshore account with my forged signature, onto the stack, I looked directly into his eyes. This is not just a settlement. This is history correcting itself, and for once, you don't get to rewrite it. The judge ruled in my favor, awarding me not just half of the empire, but acknowledgement as co-founder and rightful architect of Sterling Enterprises. The verdict was more than financial. It was validation carved into law, a permanence Robert could never undo. As the gavel struck, Robert's head dropped into his hands. The man who had once filled ballrooms with his laughter now sat diminished, drowning in the silence of defeat. Around us, whispers rose, not about me this time, but about him. About the fraud, the arrogance, the downfall. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt the sun on my face, as if for the first time in years. Cameras flashed, questions flew, but I didn't flinch. My heels clicked against the marble steps with a rhythm that sounded like freedom. Later that night, alone in my kitchen, I poured a glass of wine and allowed myself to exhale. I thought of the ballroom where this had begun, of the emerald silk dress, of the bracelet abandoned on the concrete. I thought of the younger version of myself who had believed in forever. And I whispered to her softly, "We made it out." Yet even in victory, the ache lingered. Because winning didn't erase the years stolen. It didn't erase the nights I lay awake waiting for a husband who never came home. It didn't erase the silence of children we never had because his empire always came first. Revenge had given me justice, but it could not give me back time. Still, as I watched the city lights flicker outside my window, I realized I no longer needed his recognition. I had given it to myself, and that was enough. The weeks after the final ruling felt strangely quiet. For months, my life had been consumed by courtrooms, headlines, whispered gossip, and the endless tug-of-war between truth and deception. Now the noise subsided. My name was no longer a scandal splashed across the morning news, but a steady headline in business journals, a reminder that the narrative had changed, and this time I had written it myself. The settlement secured my financial independence. Yes, but what mattered more was the acknowledgement etched into legal records: co-founder, architect, equal. Words that should have been spoken decades earlier, but that now carried the weight of justice. I moved out of the old estate, that mausoleum of lies, and into a smaller house by the sea. It wasn't grand or dripping in marble, but it had wide windows that filled the rooms with sunlight and the steady music of waves against the shore. Here I could breathe. Here I could begin again. The first weeks were filled with disorientation. For so long, my identity had been tethered to Robert, his needs, his empire, his shadow. Without him, I found myself waking in the middle of the night, reaching across the bed instinctively only to touch emptiness. I would catch myself planning dinner menus for board members who no longer mattered, or glancing at the clock wondering when he'd arrive home. Habits linger long after love has died. But slowly I began to replace them with new rituals. I planted roses in the garden, tending them with the same care I had once given to his reputation. I cooked meals not for appearances, but for myself, savoring flavors I actually loved. I walked along the shore each morning, the sea air reminding me that time still moved forward no matter how deep the scars of the past. Letters began to arrive, some from strangers, women who had endured similar erasures, thanking me for giving their silent stories a voice. Some from former colleagues who admitted they had underestimated me, who confessed they had turned their eyes away out of cowardice. Each letter was both balm and burden-proof, that my story had rippled outward, that my wounds had become a mirror for others. One afternoon, as I sorted through these letters, I found a small box on my doorstep. Inside was the bracelet I had abandoned that night outside the hotel ballroom, its velvet box worn, the engraving still intact, the coordinates of Malibu. There was no note, but I knew it was from Robert. Perhaps a gesture of remorse. Perhaps an attempt at tethering me to a memory he could no longer control. I held it in my hands for a long time before deciding to place it in a drawer, not to wear, not to treasure, but to keep as a reminder of promises broken and lessons learned. Months later, I heard that Robert had stepped down entirely from Sterling Enterprises. The board had no choice but to sever ties, citing breach of trust and ethical violations. Vanessa disappeared from public view soon after. Some whispered she had left the city. Others said she had taken a quiet job far from the glittering rooms where she once stood victorious. For the first time, the empire that had consumed my life no longer bore the weight of my name or his. I thought I would feel joy at his downfall, but instead what I felt was release. Because revenge is loud, but peace is quiet. And for the first time I had peace. Still, there were nights when the silence pressed too heavily, when loneliness crept in like an unwelcome guest. I wondered if I would ever trust again, if I would ever let another person close enough to risk betrayal. But then, on a summer evening, as the sun melted into the sea, I realized something I didn't need to be defined by whether or not love returned. I was whole even in solitude. My worth was never meant to be measured by another's devotion, it was always mine to claim. I began to write, pouring my story into pages that might one day become a book. Not a memoir of scandal, but a testimony of resilience. Because if my life had taught me anything, it was this: silence can bury you, but it can also incubate strength. And when you finally speak, your voice can change everything. On the anniversary of the night that started it all, I lit a candle on the balcony of my seaside home. I poured a glass of champagne not to toast Robert, not to mourn the years lost, but to honor the woman who had endured, the woman who had emerged. I whispered to the waves, "We are not useless. We never were." And perhaps that is the lesson I leave you with. Betrayal will scar you, but it will also reveal you. Revenge may satisfy, but healing transforms. The life you thought was over can become the soil for a new one, stronger, freer, truer. If you've listened this far, if you've walked with me through the shadows and into the light, then I ask this of you: share this story. Like it, if it touched you, subscribe. If you want to hear more voices like mine, and most of all, leave a comment. Tell me your truth, your scars, your resilience. Because none of us are alone. Not really. We are the women who were called useless, and we are anything but.